There is a version of your life that lives entirely inside your head. It is vivid, it is detailed, it has a beginning and a middle and a version of you that finally became everything you always knew you could be. You have visited it thousands of times, late at night, in the shower, on the commute, in the quiet moments between one ordinary day and the next. And in that version of your life, you are not stuck, you are not waiting. You are not telling yourself that you will start next week, next month, next year, when things settle down, when the timing is right, when you feel ready. In that version, you already started, you already became. And then you open your eyes, and nothing has moved. And somewhere underneath the dream, in a place you do not visit as often as you should, a quiet question sits waiting. Why? The easy answer is laziness. That is the story most people tell about themselves and about others who dream without doing. They are lazy, they are comfortable, they do not want it badly enough. But psychology has spent decades looking at this exact pattern, and what it found is not laziness. What it found is something far more complex, far more human, and far more worth understanding than a character flaw ever could be. It starts with the brain, specifically with a structure called the nucleus accumbens and the dopamine system that runs through it. When you imagine achieving something, your brain does not clearly distinguish between imagination and reality. The same neural reward pathways that fire when you actually achieve something fire partially when you simply think about achieving it. Which means every time you visit that vivid imagined future in your head, every time you feel the feeling of having arrived, your brain receives a small but real dose of the reward it was supposed to get for actually doing the work. The imagination becomes a substitute for the action, and the more convincingly you can imagine the achievement, the more complete that substitution becomes. Psychologist Gabriele Oettingen spent over 20 years researching this exact mechanism. She called it mental contrasting, and her findings turned conventional wisdom about positive thinking on its head. She found that people who visualize positive outcomes without confronting the obstacles between them and those outcomes consistently perform worse than people who never visualize at all. Not slightly worse, significantly worse, because the brain, having tasted the reward of the imagined arrival, reduces the motivational drive to actually make the journey. The dream becomes the destination, and the person who dreams most vividly often moves least. But there is another layer underneath this one that is less about neuroscience and more about fear. Because for many people who dream big and do nothing, the doing is not actually the problem. The problem is what the doing represents. As long as the dream lives only in the imagination, it is perfect, it is protected. It exists in a space where failure is impossible because nothing has been attempted. The moment you begin, the dream becomes real. And the moment it becomes real, it becomes something that can fail, something that can fall short, something that can prove once and for all that the version of you living inside your head is not the version of you that actually exists. And that specific terror, the terror of discovering your own limits, keeps millions of people in a permanent state of preparation, always almost starting, never actually starting. Carol Dweck, the Stanford psychologist whose research on growth mindset changed how entire school systems think about potential, found something important about the people who fear beginning. They tend to believe, at a deep and largely unconscious level, that ability is fixed, that you either have what it takes or you do not. And if that is your operating belief, then attempting something and failing is not just a setback, it is evidence. It is proof of a verdict you were already afraid was true. So the safest thing, the psychologically logical thing, is to never attempt at all, to keep the dream alive and uncontested in the imagination where it cannot be disproven. There's a concept psychologists call self-handicapping. It was first identified by researchers Stephen Berglass and Edward Jones in 1978, and it describes a behavior that looks irrational from the outside but makes complete psychological sense from the inside. Self-handicapping is when a person creates obstacles for themselves before attempting something, so that if they fail, the failure can be attributed to the obstacle rather than to their own ability. The The person who dreams big and does nothing is often engaged in the most complete form of self-handicapping available. By never starting, they ensure that the dream can never be tested, and an untested dream is infinitely safer than a tested one because it can never return a verdict. But here's what makes this pattern so persistent and so difficult to break. It feels like something other than what it is. It doesn't feel like fear. It doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels like wisdom. It feels like patience. It feels like waiting for the right moment, refining the plan, doing more research, getting more ready. The internal narrative around inaction is almost always sophisticated and compelling, and because the person living it is intelligent enough to construct that narrative convincingly, they are often the last person to see through it. Psychologist Timothy Pitchell has spent decades studying procrastination, and he makes a distinction that most people never encounter outside of academic research. He separates procrastination from delay. Delay is rational. Sometimes waiting is the right strategy. Sometimes more information genuinely helps. Procrastination, on the other hand, is the irrational, voluntary delay of an intended action despite knowing that the delay will make things worse. The key word is voluntary. The key word is irrational. The person who dreams big and does nothing almost always knows at some level that the delay is not making them more ready. It's just making the dream safer. And knowing that and continuing the delay anyway is the definition of procrastination, not laziness, something more like emotional self-protection operating at a scale the person cannot always see from inside it. And then there's identity, because perhaps the deepest reason people dream without doing is that the dream has become part of who they are. The person who is going to write the book, start the business, move to the new city, change everything. That person has an identity. They are someone with a plan, someone with potential, someone who has not yet shown the world what they can do but could at any moment. And that identity is valuable. It is comfortable. It protects against the alternative identity, the person who tried and didn't make it, the person who started and stopped, the person whose dream turned out to be smaller than they imagined. As long as the doing never begins, the potential never expires. And unexpired potential is a remarkably comfortable place to live. The honest truth is that dreaming and doing require completely neurological and psychological states. Dreaming is expansive and safe and requires nothing from you except your imagination. Doing is contracting and uncomfortable and requires you to be smaller than the vision for as long as it takes to build toward it. Every person who has ever built anything real spent a significant portion of that building feeling like they were going backwards, feeling like the gap between what they imagined and what they were actually producing was evidence of failure rather than evidence of process. And getting through that gap without retreating back into the dream requires something that nobody talks about enough. Not motivation, not discipline. Tolerance for being in the middle of something uncomfortable without knowing how it ends. The people who dream big and do nothing are not lacking ambition. They have more ambition than most people will ever know. They are not lacking vision. The vision is clearer and more detailed than you would believe. What they are carrying, quietly and often invisibly, is a fear so specific and so well disguised that it has convinced them it's something else entirely, something reasonable, something sensible, something worth waiting for. And the saddest version of this story is not the person who failed, it's the person who never found out, who carried the dream all the way to the end without ever discovering whether the version of themselves living inside their head had been real all along. And most of the time, it was. This is the psychology that nobody explains because it's too close to home for too many people. New video every week on Sophix, the science of what's really happening underneath. Subscribe if this is the conversation you want to keep having. I'll see you next week.